I firstly want to thank and take the opportunity to thank Career Development Services for such an engagement. I think it's a very worthy engagement for us to be having, especially in the times that we find ourselves in. And before I actually move ahead, I also need to acknowledge the presentations we've been privileged to listen to this morning. Opening us into the sectors of education, both DBE and the PSET, really talking about what the impact has been of the COVID pandemic into their work, and more predominantly in career development within their sectors. Colleagues, I cannot emphasize the importance of reflection. Reflection actually puts us in a position where the Deputy Minister spoke to, where we are able to think critically and pause for a moment, and create an opportunity for us to explore and exploit for critical construction for the future. And I think, as we've heard this morning, career development is actually the facilitator of education in preparation for the labour market. And I also want to lean on a definition by Niles and Co. in 2005, where they defined career development as that lifelong psychological and behavioural process that shapes one's professional career over time. And I cannot emphasize how important this notion of overtime is. And we've heard, stemming from DBE, transitioning into the PSET, this is a critical facilitator of shaping one's profession. But I think I would want to be of the opinion that we're actually on the right path. We have not deviated much. The pandemic has actually propelled us now more than ever to be in an opportune space to be exploiting what we've been privy to. We've heard what Mr. Mvalo spoke to earlier on about the needs, and I think the pandemic has also widened this margin of needs. And I think it's very important for us to take a moment and think about old traditional principles and how we can bring those traditional principles back into our spaces. An example of a traditional principle is the traditional practice of distance learning. This has worked for centuries, and if we use those principles embedded in distance learning, that could help us leverage and facilitate career development for people like our needs sitting in rural areas. That could help facilitate that. Within the higher education institutions, we've seen the adoption of various learning and teaching strategies, remote, low-tech, facilitating where we find ourselves in. We've seen KETA play a pivotal role in facilitating the conversations in the higher education institutions around career development, career services and academic planning. We cannot separate the importance of academic advising and career advising in shaping the future. So it's really important in instilling those behaviors continuously, and it's all not just left up to chance or just face-to-face interactions. There are various platforms, and we've heard Mr. Mvalo and Dr. Mabua speaking earlier on around the technologies that we can leverage, the social medias, the websites. There were questions around the rurals without data and access. If we adopt principles of distance learning, we can adapt those principles to facilitate and almost overcome the challenges we face of data and device accessibilities. The literacies are also critical in helping us facilitate this, because we make the assumption that when we put something on a website, students or learners can navigate it because they can navigate a cell phone. We've since seen with the pandemic that it's not so easy for students to work off a learning management system, which is very simple because they just need to download slides and engage in assessments. But we also need to think about embedding those literacies throughout their experience. We've heard also the trimming of the syllabus from DBE that has impacted this. How can we use a multimodal approach to help facilitate these things, ensure that learning continues, but also supporting the learners? This could be in an asynchronous fashion and not necessarily synchronous, because we find ourselves in changing times. And if we go back to the definition by Miles' colleagues of career development, we really need to disaggregate the components of career development. We need to really look at how career counseling looks, how career advising looks, and more importantly, how career services looks as a transitioner into the labor market. But if we view this, according to what Niall says, as a process and not an event, we will really be committed to embedding the psychological and behavioral components that will intentionally embed the significance of this process into both DBE and the PSET. Colleagues, there was a question presented earlier around asking DHET around facilitating conversations. We've seen that SAGIA, the South African Graduate Association, really host a very successful virtual career fair in this pandemic. Is SAGIA a lever that DHET can lean towards based on their experiences to open up the sector? We've been speaking about these silos of excellence. It's time for us to really tap into those collaborations and partnerships, especially in places where things have existed. The DHET has actually funded a collaborative project that includes 7 institutions of higher learning through the UCDP to establish the first academic advising association in South Africa. And that was since launched 2 months ago, ELETSA. And is that possibly another lever we could lean towards for collaboration and partnership, because they have the skills, the scholarly and the practice of facilitating career advising. We've got the South African career practitioners, that we can leverage on. How can all of these come together? We've got the SETAs in our space. We've got KETA. We've got Indlela. We've got all of these. But the challenge, colleagues, is how do we bring them all back together so that we have a brand that shapes career development for the future? As I mentioned, various approaches have been illuminated by the COVID pandemic. We need to reflect on these approaches and see how we can adopt and adapt these approaches to speak to how we silhouette career development services at our institutions. I really want to share quickly from the University of the Free State how we've embedded within our learning and teaching strategy the foci on flexibility that enables resilience and adaptability. And, institutions have caught onto this fever of graduate attributes. Is a possible graduate attribute we need to look at embedding into career development services, a graduate attribute of entrepreneurial mindset. This is an attribute that could potentially help us shape from as early as DBE the learners and the students for a future that is ever changing. This is an attribute that solidifies not only the skills, but also taps into the attitudes and the behaviors that shape one personally, academically, and professionally. So, I really would like to hear the thoughts of colleagues of, an attribute of entrepreneurial mindset. We've seen private companies tapping into their graduate programs the notion of entrepreneurial mindset. Is this potentially another lever that could help us shape career development post-COVID-19? And just in my concluding remarks, I just also want to share that a study by Grit Lab in July of 2020, which was during the pandemic, showed that 86% of the respondents to their survey indicated that remote working is possibly the future. And the question we are confronted by is, are we shaping the learners and the students for such a remote multimodal labor market? Colleagues, we cannot lose sight of where the pandemic has propelled us to. There was earlier on comments around how 2 years ago, we were talking about having ranked 5 out of 10 in terms of our readiness for the fourth industrial revolution. But I firmly believe the pandemic has really propelled us into a new light that provides us with opportunities. There's notions and conversations about the blended approach, the high flex approach, the synchronous, the asynchronous. We need to tap into these colleagues, into our already deeply entrenched services of career development like KETA, so that we can facilitate this and we don't lose the opportunity to integrate and enhance the practice through the technologies, but also not losing the essence of the learning that takes place. And in concluding, colleagues, it is now more than ever opportune for us to really stand together and partner with each other in tapping into the space that helps us explore and exploit. We are confronted by constraints of data and device availability, but could adopting the low-tech distance principles really help us ensure that we at least trigger and tap into that space that will ensure that we are shaping career development, the learners and the students for a future. Thank you very much, colleagues.